Okay, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Shira Newman. I'm the coordinator of arts programming here at the Rady JCC. I'm pleased to welcome you all to the 2022 edition of Music and Mavens. I would like to thank our sponsors, the Babs Asper Center for Cultural Arts, the Asper Foundation, Jewish Federation of Winnipeg, Winnipeg Arts Council, the United Way, Manitoba Arts Council, the Lamp Family Fund, Winnipeg Free Press, Jewish Post and News, Classic 107, and our individual donors for financial support and commitment to our 2022 Music and Maven series. The Rady Jewish Community Center is located on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Before we start with today's presentation, I'd just like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. First, while we anticipate that there will be no technical issues during our presentation, please remember this is live, and despite our best efforts, we may have some glitches and we will work swiftly to correct any unforeseen issues. Thank you for bearing with us if that is to happen. We will be taping today's session and we'll make it available for viewing on the Rady JCC Music and Mavens YouTube channel. Thank you so much for joining us. We're glad to be here with you. Now I will turn things over to Carla Berbreyer, Music and Maven's founding producer.
There, I forgot to unmute myself. Hello, welcome everybody. It's great to be here on our first Music and Maven's presentation. It would be lovely to be in person, but it's so nice to have you on the screen. And as Shira mentioned, because we're recording today, if you want to have your screen on, that's fine, but we will be recording, so your face will be on the recording. So I'm just throwing that out there, and it's up to you if you'd like to remove your screen or be present with your face visible, which we're comfortable either way. So today, for our first speaker on the Music and Maven series, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Orysia Kulick. Now, Dr. Kulick is an assistant professor at the University of Manitoba, where she is cross-appointed between two departments, political studies and German and Slavic studies. She teaches a range of courses on Ukrainian culture and society, Russian and comparative politics, and the politics of memory. Dr. Kulick received her PhD in history from Stanford University in 2017, where her studies focused on the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and the Russian Empire. Her research is on regional elites in post-Stalin Soviet Ukraine, the personal networks that shaped its relations with Moscow, and how both influenced politics in the center of Soviet power. She's actually working on a book right now titled Provisionally, How Ukraine Ruled Russia, Regionalism and Party Politics After Stalin. Her second project is a micro-history of the concentration camp Mittelbau Dora, which follows a small group of Ukrainian nationalists into underground tunnels where the Nazis manufactured their infamous V1 and V2 missiles. Now, when Orysia and I first started speaking about her talk on Music and Mavens, there was a great deal of focus in the news on the refugees that had gathered in the forests in Poland and the evolving situation between Poland and Belarus. The topic, Lukashenko, what is he thinking, derived from those conversations. Throughout the course of today's presentation, you are welcome to send questions at any time to Orysia. Please forward your questions to me, and I'm going to send you a little chat right now, which hopefully will show up. I'm going to please send all questions to me. So hopefully you're going to get this right now. Okay, so hopefully you all received that message. And if you have any questions at any point, don't hesitate to send them, and I will find the appropriate time to ask your question to Orysia. Now, Orysia is not in Winnipeg today, she's in Cleveland, Ohio. So that makes the virtual aspect of this actually much easier. Welcome to Music and Mavens, Orysia Kulick.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm losing my sense of time. I appreciate the opportunity to speak about this very important topic with all of you. Carla, thank you for the invitation to do so. It gave me an opportunity to think through some things that have been in the back of my mind, and I'll be sharing some of that with you today over the course of the next half hour or so. So the title, Lukashenko, what is he thinking, I think is a pertinent one. And both from the perspective of contemporary politics, but also from the perspective of the past. I just want to check in and make sure you can hear me. Okay. So I was approached by Carla Burbreyer a few months ago about coming to talk to you all about the refugee crisis unfolding on the Polish-Belarusian border. And as I started to prepare for this talk, in the articles I read about the phenomenon, a story started to come together in which the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, encouraged or lured, depending on the person writing the article, refugees from locations such as Iraq, Syria, or Yemen, primarily, though there are some from other places as well in the Middle East. These individuals were encouraged to board planes to Minsk, the capital of Belarus, and they would come from airports in Istanbul, Beirut, Damascus, Dubai, land in Minsk, stay the night, and then from that point, make their way to the border of Poland, where they'd cross in the forest, into the forest near the village of Białowieża, which borders not only Belarus, but also a national park. And I just remembered that I'm supposed to share with you some images, so bear with me for a moment. The Białowieża forest is a UNESCO heritage site, and it is often referred to as the last untouched wilderness of Europe, or Europe's last remaining primeval forest. It's the last bit that remains of forests that once covered all of Northern Europe centuries ago. And as a result, the park is seen as a conservator of European ecological history and biodiversity. The inner zone is an old growth forest, which means that it has been living all this time without much human interaction, without human intervention spanning about 800 years. So this is a really cherished treasure of European and world significance. I've seen similar forests in California where I did my PhD. The Avenue of the Giants, for instance, which you will see pictured here. These are large redwoods that used to cover the Pacific Northwest. And these trees and forests are really a sight to behold. And here I include a picture with one of my good friends, Jumana, for scale. That's her down here in the lower left corner. And she's there among the giants of California, the redwoods. So at Białowieża, this inner circle is limited. There's limited access. Tourists very rarely go in there, and only in small numbers. And this is to limit the human impact and protect the forest, which is home to the largest population of the property's iconic species, which is the buffalo, the European bison, excuse me, which was on the first slide of my presentation. And also I learned the European lynx, which up until this refugee crisis at the border moved seamlessly between Poland and Belarus. These two countries share essentially one forest in which a post-World War II border was drawn through the middle of it. Poland, as we know, is in the European Union, gaining membership in 2004. EU membership comes with some unexpected consequences. Countries with this kind of ecological inheritance find themselves caught between Brussels, the capital of Belgium, and also the administrative seat of the European Union. And those factors that shape, that involve managing this ecological inheritance on the ground. I saw this in Ireland, for instance, with their peat bogs, a fossil fuel that the Europeans tried for years to get them to stop harvesting for fuel, even though the Irish had been doing it for more than 1,000 years. Scotland will soon put in a bid to get one of its blanket bogs called the Flow Country, Europe's biggest peat bog. And they want this too to be recognized as a World Heritage Site, like the Białowieża Forest. And the Białowieża Forest on the Polish side of the border is no exception to this greater involvement from Brussels. As The Economist reported in 2017, the European Commission had asked the European Court of Justice, the ECJ, to fine Poland for ignoring an earlier order to halt logging in parts of the forest under EU law. In effect, nearly all of the 60,000 hectares that lie in Poland. In July, UNESCO, the guardian of the planet's human and natural wonders, urged the government to end logging or risk Białowieża's demotion from a World Heritage Site to one in danger. And this angered Belarus because they have the other half of this forest within the boundaries of Belarus. And the status of their national forest would also be affected. The Economist went on to say that the international alarm is understandable. The mixed forests that once blanketed Central and Western Europe have long since been turned to timber or fuel. Białowieża's towering oaks, hornbeams, spruces, plus the European bison and other endangered species that roam beneath their canopies offer a unique glimpse of the continent's ecological past, end quote. So in other words, the logging and other things that are happening on the ground, which Poland argued was necessary for managing the forest and preventing things like logs falling on cyclists or runners, those arguments didn't necessarily hold up in Brussels, which the EU allows for, but they said that Poland was going well beyond this and that they were culling this treasured forest beyond reasonable measures. Some criticized the use of heavy machinery. Scientists pointed out the need to leave the trees in place as the microbe-rich redwood is vital to forest renewal. The older the tree, the more fertile its remains, said Rafał Kowalczyk in this same article from The Economist. He runs the Polish Academy of Sciences research station in the Białowieża Forest. So you see in this tension of interests on the ground, scientific and economic, and also between Poland and the European Union. Yes, Poland is a member and subject to the EU's rules and regulations, and not just with forest management, but across a number of areas, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. The EU is also not a monolith, and that's part of the theme of this talk. All the disparate parts that make up the European Union are sort of tugging at one another, and that's part of this story. Lukashenko, what is he thinking? And this example of the management of the Białowieża Forest is just one instance in which we see this continental politics come into play. Now, the Belarusians have placed most of the Białowieża Forest on its side of the border under the full protection of the government. While in Poland, there have been efforts to turn this area into an ecotourism hub, which in one of the poorest parts of Poland would be an important development. But there are other factors at play here. Poland's Law and Justice Party, PiS, Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, is a conservative and right-wing formation that formed a majority government in 2015. And this government has brought Poland increasingly at odds with the European Union and European norms. In 2016, we saw Polish women come out into the streets in a two-day protest against a legislative proposal for a total ban of abortion in Poland. It was called Czarny Protest, the Black Protest. from my understanding, and here are some images from that protest, which took place over 48 hours. And you can see that even despite the inclement weather, Poland's women came out into the streets en masse to stand against what they saw as a very detrimental set of new laws. From my understanding, in 2020, the Polish government, led by PiS, succeeded in passing new laws that essentially ban abortion, the consequence of which are being felt throughout the country. And having been in Ireland during its Repeal the Eighth campaign, which was a resounding vote overturning the Eighth Amendment, which essentially did the same thing, since 1918, watching Poland, also a majority Catholic country at this point, do the exact opposite was disconcerting. So, and all of this is happening within the European Union. Some are liberating and some are really clamping down on women's bodies and autonomy. And this is a sign of other things happening in Poland. A report from Balkan Insight from just 2 weeks ago, titled Poland in 2022, Can the Opposition Make Inroads into PiS's Popularity? And PiS is the Law and Justice Party that I've been talking about. And as a part of this report, there's a subheading in which Poland is described as being at war with Europe. So despite being a member of the European Union, Poland is now understood to be at loggerheads with Brussels. And one area in which this is happening is this clash over the jurisdictions of Polish and European courts. Poland is pushing back against some rulings coming out of the Court of Justice of the European Union, in which the view of the ruling government are not in line with the Polish constitution. In other words, the Polish constitution, in their view, contravenes the rulings coming out of the European Union. Of particular interest are reforms being undertaken by Poland's leading majority party that aim at establishing its control over Poland's judiciary. In essence, experts consulted for this piece argue that PiS wants to essentially be able to exempt itself from the European common legal system in essentially setting its own rules within its own borders, and picking and choosing which of the rulings apply to Polish courts, while still enjoying the benefits of EU membership, primarily in the form of cash that comes in the form of aid and budgetary allotments. In taking this position as an EU member state, Poland essentially risks undermining the entire European project. And the EU is trying to stem the tide of illiberalism within its community of states by withholding recovery funds from Poland and also attaching rule of law mechanisms to budget items, which experts estimate could amount to the suspension of tens of billions of euros to Poland, a country that has relied on this kind of aid for years. And I'm bringing these things up just to give you a sense of where things are between Warsaw and Brussels, how their relationship has been developing over the last 7 years or so. The country's illiberal turn coincides with a global movement in this direction. Just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, in 1972, Freedom House, a non-governmental organization based in the United States, which analyzes political and civil liberties in countries all over the world, classified just 44 countries as free, meaning that there were 44 fully functioning liberal democracies in the world in 1972. In 1990, that number increased to 61, and in 2019 to 86. Now, while this organization does have its critics, some believe it to be partisan, some feel it's too conservative, Some feel that it's biased against conservatives, and others think that it's simply critical of states that are pushing back against the US interests and is thus too closely aligned with policymakers in Washington. Even with keeping all that in mind, I still think the organization offers a data set that allows us to discuss certain kinds of trends, among them this move towards illiberalism that we're seeing all over the world. And in 2019, Freedom House reported that that was the 13th straight year in which the number of countries that became less free was greater than the number that became more free. And its report for 2021 was titled Democracy Under Siege, because what we are seeing in Poland is happening all over the world, including that polity to the south of Winnipeg with whom you share a very long contiguous border. Now that I live in Manitoba, I get more news about the province and Canada in general these days. And while I was preparing for my talk today, I think based on my search history and location, I read a piece about a man from Florida who was arrested and charged with human smuggling after 4 people, including an infant and teenage boy, were found dead roughly 7 miles from the US-Canadian border in the province of Manitoba. I have driven that road on 5 occasions now, 3 times in winter, that Emerson-Pembina crossing, and my heart just sank reading that story. As a Washington Post story from just this past week indicated, quote, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police said they believe that the 4 people whose bodies were found near the community of Emerson, Manitoba on Wednesday were attempting to cross into the United States from Canada and died of exposure to the cold in a blizzard during which temperatures fell to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. It seems as though they had somehow been separated from a larger group and were left to face the Manitoban deep freeze on their own. As Jane McClatchy, Assistant Commissioner with the RCMP in Manitoba, said at a news conference on Thursday, these victims faced not only the cold weather, but also endless fields, large snowdrifts, and complete darkness. I include this here to underscore 2 things. One, the refugee crisis is global and the byproduct of instability brought about by economic crises, war, and total societal collapse in certain places. Secondly, as Manitobans, I think the story of all those that I read in preparation for this talk would likely resonate with you and be most accessible when trying to understand the desperation with which refugees seek a better life. They put their lives and those of their loved ones in the hands of unscrupulous intermediaries in the hopes that they will get, in the end, to where they desire to go. Now, the illiberal turn that I have mentioned happening in Poland and the US and elsewhere has also fueled a resurgence of racism and xenophobia, or the fear of outsiders and foreigners, and also an intolerance of immigrants from certain places. And in the case of the story we are talking about today with Poland and Belarus, these migrants are coming from the Middle East. Belarus is not the easiest place to travel to under normal circumstances, and some governments, like mine in the US, dissuade their citizens from going there at all due to the arbitrary enforcement of laws and risk of detention. In the case of the refugees that were coming to Belarus, it seems as though the process of obtaining the necessary visas may have been streamlined in order to expedite their travel to Minsk. And they enter by air, like this gentleman here. He's 16 years old, traveling alone with the blessing of his parents. They travel by air, exit by land, and attempt to get into the EU through Poland and Lithuania by foot. A journalist for the Moscow Times traveled with one of the last groups of Iraqi migrants, traveling with Belavia, Belarus's national airline. And this photo is from that news story. And he documents part of that journey in a piece that ran in early December 2021. On the surface, Lukashenko's motivation seems pretty clear. And like my earlier description of what's been going on in Poland, the plan devised by Lukashenko to sort of instrumentalize these migrants is rooted not only in domestic politics, but in the larger politics of the continent and the region. In other words, there are some layers to this story. In 2020, Lukashenko was seeking his sixth term. This is a person who has been president of Belarus since 1994. He has been referred to and sometimes refers to himself as Europe's last dictator. Though with how things have been developing, we could see a resurgence of that model of government. In the 2020 election, his main opponent, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, was thrust into the spotlight after her husband was arrested. It was he who had been the opposition candidate running against Lukashenko, but he was taken into custody in what was widely interpreted as a politically repressive move, so she ran in his place. Lukashenko naturally is announced the victor after the election and a tumultuous campaign. However, Tikhanovskaya and her supporters contested the results, claiming that she won 60 to 70% of the vote. Outraged, Belarusians came out into the streets en masse in protest of what, in their view, was a stolen election. There was a sustained protest that took place over many months, with many arrests and protesters facing violent retribution from the authorities. Former detainees described beatings, prolonged stress positions, electric shocks, and in at least one case, rape while in prison. Some had very serious injuries when they came out. Police held detained protesters for days in overcrowded cells, often denying them food, water, medical assistance, and even access to the toilet. Human Rights Watch and news agencies issued scathing documentation about what happened, and the European Union responded with sanctions. Lukashenko, his son, and 13 other officials were banned from entering the EU and had their assets frozen. This measure came in response to violent repression and intimidation of peaceful demonstrators, opposition members, and journalists, according to a press release from the EU. Lukashenko's weaponization of migrants is seen as a direct response to these sanctions. By encouraging this movement of people through Belarus into the EU, he is not only stoking fears and anxieties tied to the refugee crisis of 2015, but also exacerbating tensions between European member states. And the EU continues to sanction Belarus. According to a recent Washington Post article, the European Council adopted its 5th package of sanctions against Belarus just last month, a move the EU took to protest not only continued human rights abuses like the ones I mentioned from the election, but also the instrumentalization of migrants. And the latest sanctions package imposes restrictions on 17 individuals, including some judges, and 11 entities, including Belavia Airlines, tour operators, and hotels that allegedly helped encourage and organize illegal border crossings at the border of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. Lukashenko responded with his own sanctions, banning beef from the European Union and the US, and so the struggle continues. And caught in between are, of course, the migrants themselves. The EU put pressure on Belavia and other carriers that had been purportedly creating this channel for migrants to travel from Istanbul, Beirut, Damascus, Dubai, and into Minsk. With 3 flights a day landing in Minsk from Istanbul, Poland accused Turkey of synchronizing its actions with Belarus and Russia. As Piotr Sauer of the Moscow Times reported, flight attendants on these Belavia flights noticed an uptick in passengers from Syria and Iraq in the summer. and that there had been a steady stream of these travelers since. One with whom he spoke joked that it has become a, quote, open secret, end quote, that the airline is transporting tourists, also in quotes, planning to cross the border to Europe. She said, "We have been flying refugees for months now. Everyone knows what we are doing. We all watch the news." And although the flights have led to an influx of migrants in her home city of Minsk, and there she was referring to a lot of social media images showing migrants sleeping in underpasses. She concludes, "But this is politics and we can't do much about it." And although it's not as cold as it is in Manitoba, it's still winter in Poland and Belarus. And these migrants are making their way across the border through the Białowieża forest. As Joy Neumeier wrote for the New Left Review in September 2021, migrants enter Poland on a dirt road that passes between the strict reserve on the left, where mossy logs sink into layered ground cover, so the area where, it's supposed to be safe from human intervention, and the national park on the right, which is subject to clearing and management. Because the Law and Justice Government, or PiS, will not allow them to apply for asylum or provide humanitarian aid for them, these migrants are essentially stranded in this primeval forest. Because of the moisture, many of them suffer from trench foot, which is a euphemism of war that describes what happens to one's feet when you are unable to keep them dry. There are locals who provide aid. I guess I didn't include that photo. There are locals who provide aid to the migrants or invite them into their homes to warm up, sleep in a warm bed, and have some food. But the government is not intervening in a meaningful way. And it defends its actions, as Neumeier writes, by saying that they are defending sacred Polish territory. This was, in fact, in previous centuries, a place of respite for Polish and Russian royalty. First, when Belarus and Lithuania were united in a commonwealth with Poland. And after the last of the 18th century partitions, it became a private hunting ground for the Russian Tsar, as beautifully described in Neumeier's piece. Volodymyr Cimoshevich, who as prime minister in 1995-99, doubled the national park size to its current 10,500 hectares. He echoed this view in a 2017 piece by The Economist, which quotes him saying that with its royal connections, these stately oaks and majestic roaming bison, Białowieża remains a symbol of Polishness. Whoever controls it controls the country. However, as Neumeier reminds us, the more recent past leaves much to be reckoned with. The current border through Białowieża was created at Yalta in 1945, when FDR, Stalin, and Churchill met to determine the post-war order and post-war European borders, after a total war that had destroyed the social fabric of the continent and annihilated European Jews in the Holocaust. When I was preparing for my talk for today, I Googled where Białowieża was on the map, and I did a double take because I had seen maps of this part of the world in another assignment that I was doing. I was working on putting together my syllabus for a course I'm developing titled The Politics of Memory. And I'm assigning Jan Gross's book Neighbors, which was published first in the year 2000, which will come out this year in a new edition. And I'm assigning it to my students, for my students, because it was one of the most consequential books I've read in the last 15 years. And that small and powerful volume about Jedwabne has stuck with me since the first time I read it at the University of Michigan. And it's a story about a village in which, during the tumult of the Nazi occupation, one half, the Polish half, turned against the Jewish half, murdering them in a most brutal fashion over the course of a day. And Gross's book includes a map with the following caption: Bermuda Triangle of July 1941 massacres of Jews by their neighbors. Jedwabne is an hour and 45 minutes by car from Białowieża. which means in this area in which this refugee crisis is unfolding, it is haunted with a past that is much more recent and painful for us than the era of Catherine the Great and the Polish nobility and Russian royalty. And I'm just going to show you briefly. So this is where the migrants are crossing. That's Białystok, and here we see it again. And here is the Bermuda Triangle that Jan Gross was referring to. And along with its illiberal, along with its turn to the illiberal in the courts and in terms of the laws impacting women's health and its refusal to grant migrants asylum, the Polish government is also overseeing a battle in Poland unfolding over history and memory. And historians are very much under fire for retelling the events of the Second World War as truthfully as they can, based on the evidence at hand. And I'm left with more questions than answers about where all this is going. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me just see. Hold on. Okay. Okay. Wow. Thank you, Orysia, for a very, very detailed presentation and taking us from the history of how important this forest is to Poland. I'm opening this up to anybody who would like to ask questions, and you're welcome to unmute yourself too if you would like to ask directly to Orysia, or you're welcome to send me the message as I've indicated in the chat, and I will present it to Orysia myself. I think I'm just going to get started here. Oh, okay. Well, I see questions are coming in. Wonderful. Okay, first of all, Orysia, a question I see that has popped up is, do you think there is a resolution to this crisis?
I'm not entirely sure. The EU has put a lot of pressure on they're trying to sort of stem it by putting pressure on the entities that were bringing these migrants to Belarus in the first place. So they're pressuring airlines. They're trying to prevent them from leasing, for instance, airplanes manufactured in other EU states. So sort of inadvertently kind of cutting off the channels of travel, but I don't think fundamentally addressing what's bringing the migrants to Europe in the first place. And to tackle that, you have to address this sort of broader issue of what's creating instability in places like Syria and Iraq. How do you stabilize those countries so that people aren't leaving and along these very dangerous paths? And that would require a lot of coordination and political will that I don't think we're seeing right now.
Another question, do you think that this has improved at all since the beginning of the crisis?
I am not sure of that either. I mean, I can't answer that. I'm not sure if they're there in the same numbers, if they've moved. It sounded like they were still there, kind of doing the best that they can in these makeshift camps, and that there wasn't a lot of movement. And if the European Union is sanctioning them in December, so basically several weeks ago, renewing their sanctions based on the instrumentalization of these migrants, it seems as though they're still there and in sizable numbers. So I don't think there's been market improvement.
Do you see that do these sanctions tend to have any impact on Lukashenko's determination to continue to bring the migrants through to Poland? Is it having any impact whatsoever?
Not that I can tell. I think that they're sort of, from what I gathered, I think they're working kind of around him. But whether or not the inability to travel to Europe, well, the freezing of assets might have an impact, but I haven't seen it sort of move him off off the course that he's chosen on this particular issue. Maybe over time, as the impact of those sanctions sort of takes effect, he might change his behavior, but also I think we have to take into account what's happening more broadly in Europe at this time. And Lukashenko is also seen as somebody who's cooperating, who cooperates with Moscow. And Moscow is currently maneuvering in ways that suggest that they might stay the course for a while, just to keep the pressure on Europe and the United States.
I know that you mentioned the pride that Poland has in its forest and the importance of maintaining the forest as a source of pride for all Polish people. These migrants living in the forest then are going to cause some destruction of this natural beautiful forest. And is that not something that the Polish government then would see as something that they should step in and do something about, if it's only to maintain the eco-tourism of their own assets?
Well, the sense I got was that this particular government isn't swayed by sort of environmental preservationist arguments. They're kind of at odds with scientists or preservationists who are saying, you know, we really shouldn't be doing all of this in this space. I think they see it more as like a symbol of historical Poland, old Poland. I don't remember if this quote made it into my speech or not, but they're amassing, you know, troops on the border to protect the borders of Poland. So they don't seem to be, they're throwing up barbed wire, which prevents, you know, these endangered species from moving freely. They're inhibiting, I think they're allowing sort of politics to trump this environmentalism that you've brought up. And it seems to be more of a concern for them to think about Poland in this mythological sense than to actually look at this space as something to preserve from an ecological and environmental aspect. And in doing so, find a solution for what to do with these people who are currently living in this forest.
Mm-hmm. Are there any organizations on the ground or involved in any way attempting to alleviate the migrant situation?
Yes, I mean, there are, if you would permit me to share a photo.
Sure.
Okay. There are a number of organizations in the area who I just want to show you this this picture of the sort of the things that they've collected to distribute among the migrants. They're stepping in where the government will not. I don't know if you can see that image.
Yes, yes.
Sleeping bags, food, other materials that they might need while in the forest. And there are also others that don't live that live nearby. They've lived there for generations. I'm sorry, I should have included these in the slide, but I did not. And I'll show you another picture of one of these migrants who's staying in one of the homes of the locals. So they have these single beds where they're, you know, they invite them in for some warm food and a place to rest and dry up. So there are definitely locals on the ground who are observing all of this and who are really concerned about what's happening. But they're definitely they're acting in place of a government who doesn't seem to be interested in addressing this.
Mhm. The Polish individuals who step forward to help the migrants, are they being penalized in any way by the Polish government?
I don't know. I didn't come across anything like that, but I can't rule it out and I can't say yes because I simply don't know.
Okay, so I'm just encouraging more questions. I see questions have been coming through, sometimes to everybody, sometimes to me personally, but continue to send your questions. And I'm going to pose a question now regarding the feeling of people in Belarus. Has there been any outwelling of empathy from the people of Belarus towards their own government, asking for some, putting Lukashenko to the question, to say, what are we doing with these people? Why are we bringing them? And
well, in the materials I read, it's hard to gauge public opinion in Belarus. I think in part because of the recent sort of crackdown on the opposition that I described as a consequence of the 2020 elections, and the fact that there was such a robust and violent response from the government there. I think yeah, that was the sense that I got, that we aren't entirely sure how they're reacting to this, how much they know. If the response of the flight attendant who I mentioned, who was actually she was actually privy to this movement of migrants through Minsk for the entire summer and fall and early winter. She indicated that there are, that they're in Minsk in sizable numbers. They're sleeping under underpasses in sort of squalor-like conditions. They're transported by buses and other means to hotels where they stay before they move on to the border. So there's certainly an awareness of what's going on. But as she said, it seems to be interpreted as political and not something that they can do very much about.
Right. So the sense, I'm seeing another question that popped up here. Is there a sense of hopelessness, do you think, amongst the average Polish person as to whether they can do anything to change the course of these events?
The average Polish person, I think there are camps. I saw a photo of one woman who works for one of these aid organizations, and there were 3 mounds. Like 3 of these migrants had died based on the journey and the conditions in which they were living, and she was very upset. But I also saw a photo of a demonstration with, black and red flags, sort of patriotic, in support of the government's decision not to be unyielding when it comes to offering the migrants asylum. In a way, it reflects what we see, for instance, in the United States, with some very vehement against the relaxation of border measures, and other constituencies who think that we need to double down and further restrict immigration. I think you see that same sort of reflection in Polish politics, and it's the same sort of, it's a similar dynamic where a conservative party has had a substantial impact on the rule of law. They've taken over the courts. They're putting through reforms and changes that are really impacting society in ways that I think leaves a lot feeling powerless in the face of this sort of conservative, illiberal, trying to find a diplomatic word, but what comes to mind is onslaught. So,
right. So I think we talked about this a little bit, Orysia, that, and you mentioned it in your presentation, that for Jewish people, there is a bit of a trigger, as there's a huge memory of the people, the Jewish people that were hiding in the forest and not getting assistance.
right.
Terrible period of the Holocaust. Another question that has popped up: why is Lukashenko allowing the migrants to come into Belarus in the first place and then trying to ship them to Poland?
Well, I mean, the sort of the story, insofar as I understand it, it's he was encouraging them to come through as a way of, one, a form of retribution in response to the sanctions that were put in place against him and some members of his government after the crackdown on the protesters in 2020. So there was a stolen election in the view of the protesters. The protesters came out, there was a very violent crackdown, and the Europeans said, well, you can't behave that way, so we're going to place sanctions on you and your closest inner circle. You won't be able to travel to the European Union. You won't, and we're freezing your assets that are here. And so I don't know if you remember the 2015 refugee crisis, where a lot of migrants were coming in from Syria and other locations, and various constituent members of the European Union were trying to figure out, well, where do we direct them? How do we house them? What do we do? And I think Lukashenko sort of calculated that, well, if we sort of revisit this, it will have a similar destabilizing effect. And it will show that, you know, we too can impact what's happening inside the European Union by encouraging the flow of migrants into Europe once again. I think that's the general gist of the story.
Okay, well, I'm not sure if there's any more questions coming through at this point, but I know that this has been a very enlightening discussion and rather terrifying at the same time, as we all feel that unsure of how to improve the situation, but very conscious that this is a situation that does need greater powers to intervene. I want to thank you for joining us today, Orysia, and I'm glad that this has been able to work out, because I know that you're in Cleveland right now, as you're not teaching physically at the University of Manitoba until the classes reopen. And so this has worked out well, that we can still continue to have you as part of Music and Mavens and do it in a virtual manner. So thank you to everybody who has joined today, and I hope to see you at future Music and Mavens presentations. We have another one on Thursday. Thank you very much for joining, and until next time, so long.